I speak about a glacier called Tshojo Glacier, which is in Bhutan. So we got back a couple of weeks ago from our fieldwork up there. So I just want to note PhD student Sonam, who's just sitting at the back there. Credit goes to him for a lot of the data sets that I'm going to mention here, a lot of the kind of social data collection. He spent a lot of time running around several kilometres of Bhutan interviewing people for this. He's also got a talk in the next session, I think, later this afternoon. So it's kind of, mine's a little bit of an intro, and then Sonam's goes into a bit more detail on some of the other work we're doing. So this work is done jointly with BHI, who are the business arm of the Royal Government of Bhutan. Okay, so just a quick intro. So before we start, I should say I've come at this very much from a physical science point of view. And then the more we've got into this project, the more I think we've all realised that we need to kind of consider the community engagement, and we need to do more on the kind of social and cultural elements. So this talk is going to drift from kind of environmental science through to the social part. So just to introduce the topic we're looking at. So the map shows rates of glacier thinning across the Himalaya. And what you can hopefully see, so the bigger and the redder the circles, the higher the ice loss. You can see in the eastern Himalaya, we're getting really high rates of glacier thinning. As those glaciers melt, they can form glacier lakes at the front. So this is one of our study lakes up in Lunana called Rapstrang. So basically we've got a dam at the end, which is formed from material from the past extent of the glacier, and then the lake kind of fills in behind it. So these lakes can burst, and that presents a big hazard to people living downstream, and that's what we're trying to reduce. And as I say, we very much came at this from a kind of physical science point of view, so putting in sensors, mapping, measuring, and so on, and then we've moved towards looking at what's downstream. And it's become apparent from both our work in Lunana and some global scale studies we've undertaken that actually it's what's downstream that matters far more than what's going on with the lakes. So just to briefly summarise, if you want to have one of these floods, you can do it in two ways. It's a bit like being in a bath. So you can either pull the plug out of the bath and it will drain, and you can do that through failure of the barrier at the end, in this case a moraine, or you can do it by chucking something into the bath and increasing the level of the lake. So in our case, we have things like avalanches, rockfalls, and so on. So we need to account for all of these different processes to understand the likelihood of one of these floods. So Bhutan is one of the world's most vulnerable countries to glacial lake outburst floods for a variety of different reasons. So almost all of its energy comes from hydropower, which makes it, to my knowledge, the only carbon negative country in the world, because all of its power, almost all of its power, is coming from green sources. This is also one of its major outputs, so it sells this power to countries downstream, particularly India. So you can imagine if you've got a big flood going through one of these, it's not going to be great economically or in terms of power generation. The biggest employer is subsistence agriculture. Again, a lot of these fields are in the river valleys that are downstream of these lakes because it's the only areas of flat land. So people's livelihoods are very vulnerable to these floods. We also have tourism, things like whitewater rafting, again, does not mix well with big floods. And finally, a lot of the kind of cultural heritage, population centres, and so on, again, are in these valleys. This is a place called Punakazong, which has been on that site for, I think, centuries, but has been replaced many times because it's been taken out by these floods, also by fires and other disasters. So that's why we're looking at Bhutan and why we're interested in these floods. So we're going to look at one particular glacier. So Sonam later is going to talk about Lunana up here, and I'm going to talk about a glacier called Tshojo, which is just downstream. And basically this catchment is the highest risk in Bhutan, and it's the fourth highest risk globally. So looking at these glaciers here in Lunana, and in particular Tshojo. So we're interested in Tshojo because it generated a small flood back in 2009. So hopefully you can see some white spots on the surface of the glacier. These are ponds on the surface. So we get big lakes like these ones here that we're quite worried about. We also get these ponds. And the question we wanted to answer is, should we actually be worried about these ponds? This shows the kind of volume of the ponds over time. So if you look at the top map, you can hopefully see, so top graph, you can hopefully see we've got an increase in the area of ponds, kind of later in our time series. And if we look at the bottom graph, we can see this is almost entirely due to growth of the big ponds on this glacier. So we're worried about what these ponds are going to do and whether they can generate substantial floods. Okay, thanks. The crosses on the map show where these ponds are, and this graph is just which pond drain. So what we can take from this is it's the same ponds that are draining and filling year on year. So for example, if we look at, which one is it, pond A on here, we can see lots and lots of crosses. That's because it's had lots of drainage and filling. And it's the red circles on here. The same if we look at pond BD, that is the black crosses and the green circles. So we're getting these ponds draining and filling, draining and filling. We modelled where that water can actually go in the catchment to see how far downstream that can go. And we do this in kind of a probabilistic way because we're not sure what the right parameters are. So we run lots and lots of models, we see which places get hit all the time, which places are some of the time, and so on. So the results, basically the blue bits show inundation, the yellow is buildings, the white is footpaths, and the black bits are bridges. The conclusion was there is some damage. It's not a huge amount, 13 buildings, footpaths, etc. But you have to keep in mind this is one of the most remote places on Earth. So if you lose a bridge, there isn't another bridge. This place is about 5 days walk from the nearest road. We know this because we almost had to walk out 110 kilometres. Luckily, managed to not have to do the full walk. So we've got these very remote places. So we can do the kind of physical science stuff, we can do the modelling, but we also need to consider who's living there and what those buildings look like. So this is where the monk lives in Lunana. So you can imagine that this building might survive better than temporary shelters like this, but also if you destroy the kind of religious and sort of cultural centre in the village, then that could have more impact than simply taking out homes. So there was a big flood in the Lunana area in 1994. So this is a kind of before and after the flood picture. It came from this lake down here and all the way down. And you can hopefully see a massive difference, a massive kind of infill of sediment between the two pictures. So again, we started off with this from very much a physical science point of view. So we went out with a radar. You can map things under the surface. But from the interviews that Sonam's done, we found that actually we can add a lot of detail to this physical data. So we think we see evidence of past lakes in the radar data, which was confirmed by the interviews. We got some vital information, so at the end of the valley, if you look behind this person with the radar, we think the water washed up there and then washed back. This made the flooding much worse. We might also be seeing some evidence of this in the radar data. So we can put together what's in those interviews to understand and reconstruct this flood. And the reason we're interested in doing this is to get an idea of how it impacted people and the environment. So something that came out of the surveys that we did is they said that a lot of their grazing land was wrecked by this flood. So you can see it's very sandy, we called it Lunana Beach. You can't graze yaks, you can't graze horses. So suddenly you've taken out half of people's grazing land. The other thing that came up was concern about provisions. So as I say, Lunana is very remote. People often buy all of their supplies for a year. If those are taken out, then that is a massive issue. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to integrate the kind of satellite data to look at the kind of geomorphological change, the radar data to get a sense of how much sediment was deposited by this flood. But then by talking to the local people, we can improve our flood reconstruction so we can understand what happened, and we can also talk about the impacts and how they might feel and react to floods in the future. And it's very different to how we might see reactions. So for example, if the warning sirens go off, people might not trust those sirens. So actually everything we're doing upstream in terms of monitoring and science and so on doesn't really matter if we don't get this community engagement element correct. So this is very much, as I say, a work in progress. We were there a couple of weeks ago, and it's something we're trying to progress, and Sonam will talk a little bit more about later. So just to summarise, we see this big change in the ponds on Tshojo, and I very much approach this as a science question. Where's the water? Where does it go? And actually, when it comes down to it, I think the stuff at the bottom is as, or probably more important in terms of assessing risk and so on. So that's really kind of what we're working on at the moment. Okay, thanks very much. Might have to take